If the traditional story of money gives us this household analogy that tells us that governments act just like any household and must get money before it can spend, then the story that we get from modern money theory must give us a different analogy. And I want to look at what I think is the most appropriate one, the idea that the government is really more like a scorekeeper in a baseball game than a household. To review, in essence, the federal government creates and destroys money through keystrokes because the federal government is the sovereign currency issuer. Spending by the government means credits. The government credits your bank's reserves and your bank credits your account. Taxes then mean debits. The government debits your bank's reserves and then your bank debits your account. When the government runs a deficit, what that means is it is net crediting accounts. The government net credits a bank's reserves, and then the bank net credits the account of the recipient. Hence, government deficits actually creates incomes as well as private wealth. We can see this going back to our sectoral balances. In recessions, and historically, at least for the most part, and expansions as well, the private sector tends to want to run a surplus. This can be accommodated by a public sector deficit. And in fact, as you've seen previously, if the government refuses to accommodate that private sector surplus with the deficits, then we find ourselves in that paradox of thrift situation, where investment is declining, the marginal propensity to save is increasing, causing output and income to drop, causing then consumption and saving to drop. This is all, of course, based on that basic accounting identity we've seen in the past, where leakages have to equal injections. That means savings plus taxes plus imports has to equal investment plus government spending plus exports. This, of course, then tells us that savings minus investment plus imports minus exports has to be equal to government spending minus taxes. This first term then reflects the private sector's desire to net save. If that's a positive number, that means the private sector wants to save more than it's investing. The second term then reflects trade positions with trade deficits, which is the norm in the United States, being the rest of the world's net saving. And from this view, then, you can think of that third term, G minus T, as just whatever number is necessary for the government to run in order to prevent that paradox of thrift situation happening, given the other two terms. You can think then of the government balance as nothing more than a scorekeeping for the other two sectors. In that case, would it be a meaningful thing to say that here Fenway Park is running a surplus against the Royals? Likewise, would it be reasonable to suggest that the commissioner should try to get some of those runs back from the Sox? And at what point should Fenway Park be concerned that they'll run out of runs? Hopefully the analogy is clear here. Fenway Park is never going to run out of runs no matter how many runs either of these two teams score. Likewise, as we've seen previously, the federal government can never run out of dollars regardless of what kind of savings either the foreign and/or the private sector wants to do. So in a sense, then, the government's budget, typically a deficit in the United States because both of the other sectors run surpluses, is more like the scorekeeping at a baseball game. If either the private or the foreign sector wants to run greater surpluses, the federal government can accommodate that by putting deficits up, by, in essence, putting greater scores up on the scoreboard. So from this perspective, we get what we call functional finance, which is the argument that we should look not to the financial numbers of dollars and bonds, of how big the deficits or the national debt is, but rather to the real effects of government policy. If there's unemployment, the government should spend more, which is to say make more dollars to get more people working. If interest rates are too high, the government should provide more liquidity, which is to say it should add more dollars to the banking system, and this is true regardless of the size of the current deficit or how big it might grow, and regardless of the outstanding national debt, which again is wealth or assets to other people. You could think of this as an owlish as opposed to a dovish or hawkish position on government deficits and the national debt. What's important is not government finances or solvency, since it doesn't really make any sense to talk about being insolvent in the currency of the sovereign currency issuer, but the real economy, which can stagnate in a paradox of thrift situation. The government can run deficits and generally should, because the private sector generally won't spend enough to produce at full employment. Likewise, the national debt is not a burden on future generations. In fact, it's an asset to current and future generations. But, and this is the important point, prolonged low investment and high unemployment may leave future generations ill-equipped to produce for themselves. And from the standpoint of modern money theory, it is fundamentally and primarily the government's responsibility to prevent that prolonged unemployment and low investment.